Are you thinking about buying your first home? Or maybe you have a family member or a friend who's in the market? Being a first-time home buyer can be intimidating. There's a lot of new terminology. The process can seem complex. I remember exactly what that feeling was like on my first home. This is currently my fourth home, and I've actually been investing in real estate for 18 years. So I have a lot of experience there, but what I found is that you need a guide, whether that's a real person or maybe a book. And that's actually what this video is about. I recently read a book by Scott Trench and Mindy Jensen from Bigger Pockets, a real estate focused publishing company and website. And the book was great. It is a guide to being a first-time home buyer. It has a lot of tips. I took a lot of notes. And in this video, I want to share with you what I found to be my 5 favorite, most practical tips that'll help you as a first-time home buyer. And if you like the tips, I think you'll like the book as well. And I'll have a link to that in the description below. Let's get started. The first big idea from the book is the concept of a roadmap. I also think about it as a checklist. If you were to go on a trip from point A to point B on a road trip across the country or something, you'd have a map, right? A lot of us use Google Maps. That makes it kind of easy. Traditionally, you use the big paper map that you have to pull out to figure out where you're going. But the point is, it's nice to have a guide when you're doing something new or going somewhere you haven't been before. And you could really think about this entire book as a roadmap for getting through the process of being a first-time home buyer through a lot of the steps that are just unknown or you're just not familiar with. So chapter by chapter is going through that and explaining each one of those. But the idea I want to help you take away here is that everybody who has a complex process uses a checklist, at least if they want to do it well. Airline pilots have a checklist. If you see them before you take off an airplane, they're looking at the whole plane and going through the checklist. Even though they've done it hundreds or thousands of times, they are going through a checklist. Surgeons, medical surgeons who are going through a surgery, they have a checklist. Did I get the right arm, the left arm? Which one am I doing here? That's important. Real estate investors have a checklist. In fact, if you want to get a copy of my closing checklist, this is the actual one I use every time I buy a property. I'll have a link below it's called my Real Estate Investors Toolkit, and it includes a checklist and also a bunch of other goodies that you'll be able to use in your real estate business if you're an investor, or even if you're just buying a home, they might be helpful for you as well. So you can get a copy of my checklist as an investor, but the point is, shouldn't you also have a guide, a checklist, a roadmap? And so the book is really a great example. The other ideas I'm going to go through are going to be part of the checklist, but this book has a lot of awesome guides that just kind of take you through the process. If nothing else, you become familiar with what are the steps to buy a property. I want to make sure I don't miss something. Some of them you're going to know, some of them will be obvious. Like, for example, you want to get a lender and get pre-approved for a loan. But there's others that might be a little less obvious, some of the due diligence steps, some of the appraisal steps. So that's what this book's about. And let me go to the next idea to go into some of the other steps that you want to remember. Idea number 2 from the book is don't be average. You probably heard your parents or an adult when you were a kid say something like this, if everybody else is doing it, you're not going to do the same thing, right? Well, when it comes to buying a home, and I'm a real estate person, so I love owning real estate, so don't get me wrong here, but there's a lot of pressure and a lot of marketing to make what's called the standard American home purchase. It's the American dream to go buy your home. And because something is so pushed like that and it's emotional and there's marketing about it, it's easy to make some bad decisions, which is what a lot of this book's about, is how do you make a smart decision as a first-time home buyer. And the typical process goes something like this. You or if you have a partner or a spouse, you finally get to a point where you're like, I'm sick of throwing away money on rent. Somebody else is making the money off of me. I should be owning a home. And by the way, as an aside, renting can sometimes be a smart thing to do, at least for a few years while you're saving money. In some cases, at really high price markets, it might make sense to rent forever and invest your money somewhere else. But that's an aside. That is not always the best thing to do. But people start with that idea, hey, I'm throwing money away. I want to buy a house. And so then they go get pre-qualified for a loan, and a lender who has an interest in giving you a lot of money, right? Because they make more commissions on that, more interest. They offer you this much money, and a lot of people max themselves out financially. They come up with the most down payment they have. They borrow the most money. They use up all their income to make them payment. And so they find themselves buying a house where they're maxed out. And the entire process is kind of an emotional decision. Often it's rushed, or hey, the end of my lease is coming. I got to go ahead and buy a house. Whichever one is the best one, I got to buy it. And if it's a hot market, people are getting competition and there's people bidding up on properties. So emotional decisions do not often lead to smart financial decisions. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in the next ideas is how do you prepare specifically so you don't always make an emotional decision. And buying a house is emotional. There's nothing wrong with that. This is a place where you're going to live, where you're going to hopefully, if you have a family, this is where we're going to raise a family. So there's nothing wrong with that, but you don't want to make a bad decision where the end result, and this is the average result, by the way, where people get stuck, where you don't think about all of the implications financially, and you end up working harder on a treadmill for decades of your life just to be able to afford this house, where you're not saving as much money, maybe for retirement or financial independence, which is something I talk a lot about on this channel. And you might get trapped in a particular location, because the average is that most people live in a home 5 to 7 years. And so if that's you, if you tend to be in that category, then you want flexibility to be able to move, to be able to have options, to be able to financially save some money. And so you don't want this one housing purchase to be a huge negative for you and make you feel stuck financially. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in the rest of this video are ideas from the book that help you to yes, have an emotionally satisfying purchase that you can live in and enjoy, but also to be financially smart about it and not get stuck. The third idea from the book might be a little controversial, but it says that your home is not an investment. Now, this is kind of interesting coming from two authors of the book who are both real estate investors. I happen to be a real estate investor and I like home ownership. I think it's a great thing. But the point here being is that the common wisdom you hear out there and kind of sold to you is that your home is a great investment. Well, actually, the authors make an argument that housing is a cost. This is not an investment necessarily. You can try to minimize your cost. You can actually try to buy homes that are going to be a better financial decision than others, but looking at it as an investment is not entirely accurate. Buying stocks, buying real estate investments, rental properties, things like that are pure investments, you can look at that and say, am I getting a return on my investment? Am I going to get back more than I put in? Well, with housing, you're actually not going to get back more than you put in. Even in the best case scenario where your home appreciates a lot and it goes up in value 5% a year, 6% a year, some of the best markets in the country, the problem is you still put a lot of money up front, huge down payment perhaps. You make payments every single month. Maybe it's in the thousands of dollars per month into your interest, into the insurance on the property, the taxes, the upkeep. So you're not going to make money. And the authors do a really good job of showing the comparison, a whole chapter on renting versus buying, and how a lot of the arguments always like which one of those is better. And in some cases, owning, the longer you're going to stay in a place, the more financially it makes sense to own a home, particularly if there's a lot of appreciation there. There's usually a crossover point, like 3, 4, 5 years into the future, where it's better, if you're going to stay that long, it's better to own the home. But in both cases, if you look at the graph, the line goes down. Your wealth is not getting bigger because you own either one of these. And so that's the point here, is not to say you shouldn't buy a home, not to say you shouldn't try to make the best financial decision you can, but the frame of reference of calling this an investment is not necessarily the right one. That even in the best case, and I'm going to give you some examples here, one of my favorite strategies for home ownership, especially early in your career, is to do something called a house hack, where you live in the property and maybe you generate some rental income from a basement apartment on Airbnb, or you live in a duplex and rent out the other side. Especially early in your career, the smartest strategy is to minimize your housing cost. If you can reduce the amount of money you pay every month into your housing, early in your career, you can reinvest that other places and actually be a pure investor, putting it in a retirement account, investing in another rental property. So that's just a kind of a quick idea that the smartest strategy early on, minimize your housing cost. Don't think about it purely as an investment. Think about making the best financial decision you can. And then let's go to some other ideas that'll help you make that better decision. Idea number 4 is called real estate exit strategies. And I think it might be the most important takeaway or step from this book. And the idea is that when you get into a property, kind of like when you enter a big room, you always want to look for the exit door. You want to know, just in case of a fire, just in case of an emergency, or if I change my plans, I want to be able to get out of this room. Well, the same thing when you buy a property. If you want to make a smart home purchase and you want to avoid that average situation that I mentioned earlier, where you get stuck in a property and you can't move, you can't move ahead financially, which a lot of people get into, then you want to have multiple exit strategies before you even buy that property. And so what are the exit strategies? What does that mean? Well, there are 3 different things that the authors mentioned that you could do with a property in general. There's a lot of variations on these that I could talk about, and I do talk about on this channel as well. The first is what most people think they're going to do. They're going to live in the property indefinitely. So you just want to make sure you can afford it in case you have changes in your career. Like what if you ran, a lot of people like to look at a scenario, if you have two people purchasing a home, could we afford this home on one of our salaries? Or if you were solo just buying this house, could you afford this house if you had to take a pay cut at a different job? So you want to build some resiliency into that scenario. Can you live in it indefinitely? That's one form of an exit strategy. The second though is that what if I move? And on average, if you look at statistics, people move every 5 to 7 years from the home, even when they buy it. So if that's the case, if that might happen to you as well, you change your job, you move cities, something changes, could you rent that property out for cash flow? Now, I know some of you might be thinking, there's no way I would ever be a landlord. I don't want to do that. I don't want to deal with it. But remember, we're talking about emergencies. We're talking about what would happen if. Could you do it if you had to? And most people, when they look at their home purchase, could I rent it out and still make cash flow? Or can I just at least pay my mortgage, taxes, and insurance? The answer is flat out no, I couldn't. So a big chapter in this book is going through what are the expenses that you would have to have if you rented the property. And I actually have a video I've done where I run the numbers on how to run the numbers using something called the back of the envelope analysis for rental properties. So check that video out. I have a link below in the description, and you can learn how to do that yourself. It's just kind of basic math, but you need to run those numbers ahead of time. The third thing is, could you sell this property for a profit? So a lot of selling a property for a profit has to do with the difference between what you buy it for and what you could sell it for. And this is known as appreciation, if your property goes up in value. And there's two different kinds of appreciation that are talked about in the book. One is kind of a passive or a market appreciation, and the other is called forced appreciation. Now, forced appreciation is a term that a lot of investors know, where you do something to the property. You fix it up, you add a bedroom, you finish off the basement. And so when you buy a property, if you're thinking about exit strategies, you always look for a property that has some room to force the appreciation, where you can do something to it. Maybe it's a fixer-upper, maybe you just need to paint it, maybe it's a simple kind of change, or maybe it's if you can handle it and you want to do it, maybe it's a major change to the property. But that allows you to force the appreciation. And then if you also buy in a good location and you really are thoughtful about the street, the house, the lot, where you're buying, you also experience often some passive appreciation. You know, on average, the national average, I think they quoted in the book, was 3.6% is what most homes go up in value. But every market's a little bit different. You know, some are 0%, some are 5%. And even within a city, I've experienced in my own town, some neighborhoods do a lot better than others. So you can think about that and be deliberate about trying to sell your property for a profit. You can think about being able to rent it out, and you can think about building some resiliency into your buy and hold strategy. Idea number 5 that I want to share with you from the book is called preparation equals your competitive advantage. So I'm recording this in 2021, which happens to be a pretty hot real estate market. It's very competitive. There's lots of people bidding on properties. And so something you might think about as a first-time home buyer is, how can I even compete? Like what kind of advantage could I have? And I want to give you a brief story from John Wooden, who is a basketball coach, a Hall of Fame basketball coach, really successful, and at UCLA. And he has a little book called Wooden, which I'll put a link to in the video description below. There's lots of little short chapters with great ideas, and one of them is called Blisters and Success. And he told the story about how every year when he had these great basketball players come in, like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Walton, Hall of Fame type players, he would spend hours with them learning how to put on their socks and how to tie their shoes. And you can just imagine these great players are kind of get exasperated and say, what are we doing? Practicing putting on socks on and off, on and off. And Coach Wooden would finally say to them, he's like, you know why we're doing this? These little tiny details. If you don't put your sock on correctly, you're more likely to have a wrinkle in your sock, or you don't tie your shoe correctly, you're more likely to get an injury and turn your ankle, or your sock might lead to having a blister. If you get a blister, you might miss a practice or two. If you miss a practice or two, you won't play your best in the game. If you don't play your best in the game, we might lose and we might have a bad season. And so he would tie everything back to these little tiny details that make them have a competitive advantage in basketball. The same thing works in anything, and in buying your first property is the same way. So what are some of the things, if you were to train ahead of time to prepare for? These are some of the things that are kind of get into in the meat of this book, but you need to focus on preparing your finances. You need to look at your credit. Is your credit score, if you're around a 700 credit score or better, is a good place to be. There are some loan programs if you have less than a 700 credit score, but you at least want to know Know that and work on it. That's one of the most important things you need to work on ahead of time. Also, your income stability. Have you worked at one job for at least a couple of years? Or if you're not at the same job, have you at least been in the same industry? If you're not, like I'm self-employed, and it's always a little more difficult to get a loan if you're self-employed. It's not impossible, but just knowing that might be a shortcoming if you're trying to get a loan. Debt to income ratio is another financial ratio they look at. And it basically just means how much are you paying in debt payments compared to what your income is. And if you get above about 45% generally, you're gonna have more trouble getting a loan. So you want to focus on paying off some of those debts if you happen to be in a higher category. And all of these things, by the way, your financial lender can help you out with this and look at each one of these if you want to start preparing. And then having enough cash. I mentioned earlier in the first idea, you don't want to, being average is running out of cash and spending every bit of the cash you have. And so saving up more money, sometimes waiting and renting until you have enough cash could be a smart thing to do. So those are financial preparations. But then also a big one that I like that they mentioned in the book is having a flexible timeline. So often we get pressured into thinking we have to do something right now. And do we make the best decision when you have a deadline, when your back's against the wall? When you're negotiating a hundreds of thousands of dollar decision, like buying a house, that's not, we often make bad decisions. So for one practical example is try to extend your lease or get a month-to-month lease when you're going to buy a property, even if you have to pay more in rent. Like what if you had to pay higher rent? You went to your landlord and say, I'll pay an extra couple $100 in rent if you'll give me a month-to-month until I buy my house. Negotiating with them, an extra $200 a month for a year would be $2,400. And people make thousands of dollars, $10,000, $100,000, $50,000 mistakes sometimes because they're rushed to get out of their lease. That's kind of crazy. So be willing to pay more in rent, or maybe even pay for the lease until they re-rent it, just so you make a good decision so you don't have to be rushed. That's a really big deal. Another thing is knowing what you want and then knowing what the reality is and kind of rubbing those up against each other. So know what you want, know the features, know the criteria, and kind of separate those into the most important criteria that you have to have. We need to have 3 bedrooms because we have a big family, or more bedrooms, or it has to be in this location close to my work. And kind of rank those criteria. And then you're never going to find a perfect house, but make sure you know the most important for you. And if you're buying it with somebody else, your partner, and be very clear on that. What do you want? And then rub that up against the reality of the market. So see what does it cost? Don't look at properties that are listed on the market. This is a big difference. Sometimes people will compare to what houses are listed for on Zillow or something. What you want to look at is what they actually sold for. So you might notice that in a neighborhood, the average house is sold for $350,000. The highest price was $400,000, the lowest price was $325,000. And so by knowing that, when you're going to make offers on a $400,000 house that is listed at $400,000, you'll know, where does that fit into what's actually sold in the last 6 months or 12 months. And you can use that to say, yeah, this is realistic, that what I'm looking for could actually find a house that's in my budget. Or you might find that, hey, this is not realistic. I'd have to pay much more than what's normal in the market, so I need to probably look at another neighborhood. So that, being realistic as well as being idealistic on what you want, and then kind of trying to combine those two is a big part of being prepared so that you can then act quickly, you can act confidently, and you're making this decision yourself. You're not counting on your real estate agent to tell you all these things. This is your responsibility. When you're buying a house, you're the one who is having to own this house for the long run. So it makes sense to prepare for these and get ready. So there's a lot more details to go into. Remember the checklist that I talked about earlier, the guide, having that preparation, a lot of the small details that I didn't cover in this video, but I think these are some of the big ones that I hope will help you with your first time purchase of a home.
Do you have any other comments or questions for me about being a first-time home buyer, or any questions about the book? I would love to hear from you in the comments below. And if you like this channel, if you like this content, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the little bell. I have new videos that come out every Friday morning about real estate, financial independence, and doing more of what matters. I think you'll also like the next video if you like this one. I have an interview with Mindy Jensen, one of the authors, about a specific technique that you can use when you're living in your house called the live-in flip. So if you've ever heard of flipping houses and making large profits, you might not know that you can actually do this with your residence as well. And it's a really awesome tax benefit to doing that. So watch the next video. You can see a link below, or you probably see a video above me somewhere here at the end, and you can check that interview out. You've been watching Coach Carson TV. My name is Chad Carson. You can also call me Coach, and this is a channel all about investing in real estate,
achieving financial independence, and doing more of what matters. See you next time.